I haven't met yet. My name is Carrie Shepard. I work at the Bloom Legal Clinic as the Montgomery Environmental Law Fellow, and I'm really excited today to be introducing our panelists and to have this conversation get started. If you are not familiar with the way this conference is working, this is a summit. So it's about building new partnerships, creating action together. So if you have any resources or ideas or questions you'd like to share with others, please feel free to put those into the chat, and we're glad to have you be a part of this broader conversation. So with that, I'm going to just take a second to give a brief introduction for our panelists. Our moderator today is going to be Dr. Daniel Wildcat, who is a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University and director of the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center. We also have Jason Walsh, who's the executive director of Blue-Green Alliance, as well as Sarah Moskowitz, who is the deputy director of the Utility Board. And finally, we have Dylan Jennings, who is the Public Information Office director at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wildcat, who is our moderator today, and very glad to have you all here, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. I tell you what, our featured speakers gave us a lot to talk about, and I'm really excited to be able to kind of facilitate this discussion, and we hope that many of you will send in questions, and we'll be monitoring the chat room and looking for questions and issues that we can address as we go through this morning. Probably the best way to start is I'm going to call on our panelists to begin with a just short 5-minute presentation about their work and how it ties into this whole issue of engagement and broadening community participation. And so I'm going to call on Jason Walsh with the Blue-Green Alliance here to get us started with call on everyone to do kind of a 5-minute intro, talk about your work, issues you're thinking about, and then we'll start the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Wildcat. It's a pleasure being here. My name is Jason Walsh. I'm the executive director of the Blue-Green Alliance. We are a coalition of labor unions and environmental organizations founded by the United Steelworkers Union and the Sierra Club, our two original Odd Bed Fellows. Back in 2006, we now have 7 national labor unions and 6 environmental organizations as members of BGA, who collectively represent about 15 million Americans. We are first and foremost a policy advocacy organization working at both federal and state levels on climate and energy and manufacturing and infrastructure and labor policy and a bunch of other policies as well. The foundational principle of our coalition and really all of our work is that Americans shouldn't have to choose between good jobs and a clean environment. We can and must have both. Bringing and keeping together the labor and environmental movements isn't always easy. Sometimes it's a pain in the butt. Our partners don't always agree, but we agree about the most important things. And we see examples of our alignment across the country. A few years ago, when governors and legislatures across the Midwest were attacking the rights of working people, environmentalists stood with union workers trying to block these efforts. Together, we fought the effort to pass a right to work bill in Michigan and fought for a ballot provision in Ohio to repeal a law that limited the ability of public employees to collectively bargain. In Minnesota, our labor and environmental partners have been working together to make sure that out-of-state construction contractors employ local union workers to build the state's wind farms. In California, time and again, unions have worked with environmental organizations and environmental justice advocates to raise job quality and advance equity in the context of strong climate laws. The bonds that form between our partners in these fights and other fights made it possible for BGA to develop and release last year a landmark platform for worker-centered climate policy, Solidarity for Climate Action. Like most of the things we do, developing the platform wasn't easy. It took about 8 months and more than 20 drafts. Such are the joys of working in coalition. But by the time we were done, all of our partners endorsed it and stood behind it, because it is grounded in a recognition that we are not only faced with a climate crisis, we are also faced with a crisis of economic and racial inequality, and that we need to be pursuing solutions to these crises in tandem and at the same time. So to give you the most top line summary of Solidarity for Climate Action, it calls for rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions based on the latest science to put America on a pathway to reducing its emissions to net zero economy-wide by 2050, making immediate major investments in the deployment of clean energy and energy efficiency across all sectors of the economy, increasing union density across the country through strong support for the rights of workers to organize, starting with clean technology sectors, where not enough of the jobs created, particularly over the last decade, are high quality union jobs. Rebuilding and modernizing America's infrastructure and making our communities more resilient, retooling and revitalizing our manufacturing sector in a way that positions US manufacturers and workers to lead the world in a new generation of low and zero carbon manufacturing, making the clean technologies that the global economy will increasingly demand, while also making all materials and products in cleaner ways, and ensuring that justice and equity are baked in to all of our climate policies with concrete provisions that include community benefit and local hiring and other policy levers that improve access to jobs and career paths for low income and underrepresented workers in the industries that will see job creation in the public investment we need to do to actually make this transformation, ensuring that both workplaces and communities, both sides of the fence line, right, are safe and clean and free of hazardous chemicals and toxic pollution, and directly addressing cumulative environmental impacts that burden frontline communities, and ensuring that people in frontline communities that have borne the brunt of environmental and racial injustice, and in communities that have been on the hurting end of changes in our industrial and energy economy, are at the front of the line for opportunities and investment in the clean and equitable economy that we're trying to build. That's a very abbreviated summary. I should highlight that it was one of our priorities from the beginning that the platform not be a lowest common denominator agenda, which is, for those of you familiar with coalitions, very easy for coalitions to produce. There are parts of our platform that were hard for some of our labor partners, calling for net zero emissions by 2050, as an example. There are parts that were hard for our environmental partners, like calling for technology inclusion in getting to net zero and calling out the fact that not enough clean energy jobs are high quality union jobs. But the fact that it was hard, I think, illustrates that we pushed our comfort zone as a coalition, and that's fundamentally a good thing. Because what we have in this platform are a set of solutions that we think are commensurate with the scale and urgency of the crises we face, and a model for how labor and green groups can tackle them together. And I would add a model for democratic policymakers who understand that advancing policies that unite our movements is essential to winning transformative legislation. I actually think we've seen abundant evidence of that latter point just this year. Over the course of this summer, some major reports and policy documents were advanced by Democrats that are centered around our platform's priorities. The report from the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and the Senate Special Committee on the Climate Crisis, the Moving Forward Act, infrastructure legislation that was passed by the House in July and has been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk ever since, the Democratic Party's policy platform, and perhaps most importantly, Joe Biden's updated and more expansive policy plans on clean energy, on infrastructure, on manufacturing, on environmental justice. All of these give me hope that we have a unifying blueprint for winning on climate, energy, and economic policy in what we hope will be a transformed political landscape next year. And I, for one, am ready to do some winning. So
okay.
I'll put it back to you, Dr. Wildcat.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Yeah, that was a good 40,000 foot view there of that big picture of the work you're doing. Very good work. I'd like to call on Sarah Moskowitz now with the Citizens Utility Board of Illinois to kind of give us a little introduction here about the work you do and what's keeping the Citizens Utility Board busy right now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wildcat, and thanks everybody for tuning in. What a fantastic crowd we've got. Before I dive in, I just want to thank Jason for his comments. I want to echo your point that this kind of work is really hard. We are a member of, for those of you who tuned into the opening panel, you heard Delmar talking about the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. We are a proud member of that, but it is difficult work to just come to the table and try to hammer a path forward. I see Carrie's smiling and nodding. He got his share of ICJC work. I'd argue that it can be really easy and kind of a cop-out to stand out there and just scream into the wind and just kind of comfort yourself with the knowledge that, like, you're right, darn it. But the real tough work comes when it's time to sit down with your partners and hammer out a path forward. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at with this panel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to go ahead and kind of introduce myself again. My name is Sarah Moskowitz. I'm the Deputy Director, still calling myself Outreach Director, Deputy Director at the Citizens Utility Board here in Illinois. CUB is a statewide nonprofit utility watchdog group that was created by state statute back in the early 1980s to represent the interests of residential and small business utility ratepayers across Illinois. We're not an environmental group. We are a consumer advocacy group. We work on all levels of utility oversight, including some lobbying in the Illinois General Assembly. We participate in dockets at the Illinois Commerce Commission, which is our state's public utility commission, and we do some work in the courts when necessary. But we also have a robust grassroots and individual consumer advocacy operation. I'd say about half of our staff of approximately 26 people spend their days interacting directly with the public via public-facing educational and organizing events, or via a free hotline that we run to help people who have issues with their utility company. So if you live in Illinois and you got an issue with the utility company, you can always call us. It's a free service. It almost seems silly to have to say this because it should be obvious, but partnerships are absolutely essential to all levels of our work. Without them, it would be impossible for us to be as effective as we are, whether it's teaming up with other entities to intervene in utility rate cases, co-presenting and crowd building with other organizations for grassroots events, or leveraging other groups' reach into their respective communities when it comes to promoting our own services. And I also wanted to kind of draw your attention that we can look at this, like the case of CUB, at least, from the perspective that for groups fighting climate change, partnering with groups like ours, which may not be an overtly environmentalist organization, fighting climate change is not in our bylaws, can be immensely powerful for environmental groups. Early on in my career, I attended a conference on organizing in favor of energy efficiency policies from basically an environmentalist perspective. And I remember being surprised to find that I was I was like the lone consumer advocate in the audience. And I remember being immensely surprised and rather offended in one session when a panelist urged attendees not to waste their time trying to engage consumer advocates on these issues. And I had to stand up and say, like, listen, I'm here, engage me. As ratepayer advocates, we can reach a broad set of constituents who might not ever show up for or have much interest in what, say, a group like Sierra Club, who I love, would have to say, right? And yet the cost savings arguments align so well with the conservation and environmental arguments, not to mention the social justice arguments and equity arguments, that forming an alliance should really be a no-brainer. Like we've already said, it's a lot of work. and necessitates a lot of patience and really strong interpersonal work. I can't emphasize that enough. More and more, the older I get, I realize it's just all about human relationships. No matter how rational and Spock-like we like to think we are, we're humans. The folks we're working with are humans. The people whose minds we're trying to change are humans. And humans are very emotional animals. So it's been a lot of fun, and I'm really excited. I warned my co-panelists when we were getting ready for this that I can talk about this stuff forever. So I think I'll leave it there and let the other panelists go. And I look forward to a lively discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. Well, I think we're going to have one, and I'm really glad to be able to introduce Dylan Jennings with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And Dylan, could you tell us a little bit about the work you do there at the commission and what you've been up to?
Yeah, thank you guys. Anin Gakinawia, Nitsa Bijakins, Indigenous Cause, Wabashashi, and Doda, Mushkazibing, and Dunjaba. My name is Dylan, or Bijakins. I come from the Bad River Band of Lake Superior and Shinabeg in northern Wisconsin. I have the honor of working for an awesome intertribal organization known as GLFWIC, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, been around for over 35 years. I'm the Director of Public Information. In addition to that, I also serve as an elected tribal council official for the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, in northern Wisconsin. I'm also an appointed member of the Wisconsin Governor's Task Force on Climate Change, and then furthermore, a subsistence harvester and cultural practitioner in our community. So very interested in these types of dialogue, because everything that we do and everything that our work is about somehow intersects or is affected by climate change. GLFWIC, for those of you unfamiliar, is an intertribal entity that works with 11 member Ojibwe tribes in the implementation and protection of treaty rights and resources. GLFWIC also has a very robust climate change division full of just really awesome individuals that have been working on some great resources for our communities, but also for our region and our areas here. And additionally, our tribal communities, oftentimes maintain very large natural resource departments with climate change either wrapped up into individual positions as work plans, or they're just integrated into everybody's work plans. And so I know it's a huge area that tribes are really have been at the forefront and pushing and advocating for both adaptation and mitigation strategies. We work with our tribal communities on a daily basis, and we see a lot of them continually working on things like adaptation plans, but also, some leading our nation, leading our regions in developing new strategies to handle and to work with, our local communities. Some things that GLFWIC's published over the last few years, some of you might be familiar with it, but I can also share it in the chat. Our climate change team has worked over the years on a tribal adaptation menu. If those of you unfamiliar with it, it's a great platform for both working with tribes, but also understanding protocol, respectful, meaningful considerations when working with tribal communities on climate issues, and how that can benefit all communities involved. And also another big thing GLFWIC's worked on is a vulnerability index, which identifies species of cultural and subsistence importance to our local communities, and basically identifies the different climatic factors that are threatening them, and what level of threat is posed to each individual species, and how, and so that we can better understand how to best advocate for policies that will impact those species in a harsh manner. And tribes all around are all inherently working on environmental justice issues and advocating for policies that reflect equity. Plain and simple, our rural communities and our harvesters within our communities, the ones that are spending the most time, subsistence harvesting for their families, for their communities, are disproportionately impacted by climate change and are feeling these climate pressures directly in real time on a daily basis. These interruptions of our harvesting patterns and our life ways have been experienced for quite some time now. And so very, very much looking forward to, these types of dialogues and to come to see how, we better partner and we better work together. So miso minik mangwewe tuyam miigwech. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dylan. Well, those are great introductions, and I think the first thing that sort of emerges out of your introductions is some of the work that we have to do, and certainly echoing what our featured speakers mentioned today. And so I'm going to throw this out just to start the dialogue, and anyone can join in among our panelists. But I think it's very clear we're living in an age where everyone is talking about systemic change. We need systemic change. We've got to address problems that are systemic in our society. Climate change is such a problem, and the issue of justice across almost all of our institutions is a similar kind of problem. And so I'd like to kind of pick up on that last point that Dylan raised, and all of you spoke to. What are your thoughts about really the most effective ways to engage those members of our society, those families, the grandmas, the grandpas, the aunts and uncles that are most vulnerable, that are taking the hardest hit right here and the impacts of climate change, and yet usually are the least represented, when it comes to people that are making the policies. So I'd kind of like to hear, what are our strategies? What are the things that you think are the most effective way to make sure that those folks aren't left out, that they do have a seat at the table? So that's the general question. The floor is open amongst this great group of panelists.
I'll take a first stab at that, since CUB has a lot of interactions with individuals who may not have kind of fighting climate change at the forefront of their consciousness when they contact us. I think it's really important to, again, a lot of this stuff just sounds so obvious coming out of my mouth, but I'll say it anyway. Start where individuals are at. Don't try to hammer your square peg into their round hole of their problem. Otherwise, they're just going to discount everything that you have to say, and you won't have been any help. We have people calling our hotline, especially right now for obvious reasons, in crisis. They're afraid of getting their lights and heat cut off. I'm mandated right now to get people to sign petitions in favor of the Clean Energy Jobs Act, but I'm not going to be like, whoa, hold up. I know you're sitting without heat right now, without lights, and your kids can't do online learning right now because of that. But first, I want to tell you about CEJA, and I want to get you to sign this. I mean, we're not going to do that. We at CUB, and a lot of this can be helped by fostering a culture of kind of entrepreneurship internally at an organization. I mean, giving the people representing your organization the tools they need to meet consumers where they're at. So to the extent that you have the freedom to not kind of build a siloed organization where you have one person who knows all about this and one person who knows all about that, and no way to connect the dots when you're actually facing a member of the public, we believe in giving everybody what they need so that they can make sure they can address the individual's needs at that time. And then once we've got the person, we've taken care of the immediate concern, then we can follow up and try to move that person up the ladder of engagement, which I'm sure is terminology that a lot of you are familiar with. So somebody hit us up last year because they thought their bills were too high. Then a new program comes out that can help them be more energy efficient, so we can reach out to them later. So really kind of not forcing the issue when the individual isn't ready for that or has more pressing needs, and being patient. It takes a minute. We hired somebody to take care of downstate Illinois outreach because their headquarters is in Chicago. And it took him about 3 years to really make inroads in the community. It's not going to be overnight. And you can't just like swing through and be like, hey, here we are. You know, you really got to take some time and build those relationships and not force it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. That's great. Jason?
Yeah, let me build on on what Sarah said about meeting people where they are, and talk about workers a little bit. I mean, look, all of us here on this panel recognize we're in the middle of a climate emergency. We don't have a lot of time to act. But I think we also recognize that as a country right now, we are in the middle of a pretty profound economic crisis that itself builds on levels of inequality and economic anxiety that have been decades in the making. So for working people, even though, you know, and by the way, most of them fully understand climate science, they're gonna prioritize the end of the month over the end of the world, right? I mean, there's just that immediate need, right, of keeping your job, holding on to it, and being able to see yourself in the future that we are trying to build here. And so the reason we focus so much on the economics of this is not just because this is really economic policy, right? We can't just, when we talk about climate policy, we have to recognize it's economic policy, it's industrial policy, but also because we have to be very, very intentional about workers in the impacts on workers who are in incumbent industries, many of which are tied to the fossil fuel economy, but then also very attentive to the kinds of jobs and the accessibility of jobs that are being created as we build this clean economy that we're all working toward. And without that intentionality, given some of the labor market dynamics, given the fragility of a lot of social insurance policies in this country, we could just see a further widening of inequality and injustice in this country that, beyond being immoral, I think is going to be a political loser. And we will lose, and we won't be able to get the stuff passed that we need to get passed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really good. Dylan, you got any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Sarah and Jason were talking about. You know, I think some of the biggest things for myself, I'd have to echo what they've said too. But you know, get our communities out harvesting. You know, that's one thing that we've been really pushing for in our own communities. The thought process may sound really simple, but you know, encouraging climate action through the lens of food sovereignty. If you truly understand our food systems and you spend a lot of time outdoors, it's very difficult to deny your own observations of what you're seeing. It's no longer something that is being pushed on you by the media or outside entities. It's something tangible that you can feel and see. And so pushing that through that lens is I think it's a very important thing. You know, and then just to echo what they've said, compassion and reaching out with respect. I agree full-heartedly with what Sarah said. You know, we can't, you know, kind of make those square pegs fit in the round holes, right? We start where people are at. And for the most part, you know, we're all I think people in general are fundamentally scared of what they don't understand. You know, there's individuals that will not work with you the minute that you mention the word climate change, right? It's like you put up this invisible barrier. And to understand that we need to be patient, we're better than that, right? We can't you know, we can argue till we're blue in the face, but that doesn't do any good. And one of the biggest things we see in our nation these days and these times is the inability for people to respect each other and to be tolerant of other cultures and differences. And so we need to remember that as we're doing this work, and that's why it's not easy work, right? And then I think just really, really simply education at an early age. You know, in Wisconsin, this is something we've talked about on the, you know, on the task force here too. You know, Wisconsin, you know, there was a Act 31 that was passed years ago that mandated that all public schools in the state had to educate about Native American history and cultures, and that was to help soften the atmosphere that, you know, tribal communities were dealing with a lot of backlash after treaty reaffirmation time. And I fully believe we need some sort of legislation that mandates that we talk about climate change in our public school systems and stop and begin to destigmatize that, right? And that make sure that these issues are taught about and incorporated into our curriculum so that we as adults aren't tiptoeing around the word itself.
Mhm. No, that's great, Dylan. I want to pick up on that because it leads me to a second question that you guys have all touched on in your own way. But, I mean, we talk a lot about those of us that work in universities, the silos that knowledge is trapped within, and the disciplines that people get trapped in. I'm always thinking of Roger Poulardi, a climate scientist out at NOAA, out at their laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. And he was with a group of scientists and made the comment. He said, we keep, talking about what the problem is. And he says, look in this room, look at where we work. And part of the problem is that the world has problems and we all work in departments. And, I think part of the challenge is, and I want to throw this out to the panelists. I think we got some great opportunities to kind of plumb this. Let's really dig deep. What are your thoughts about how you get people that ordinarily aren't talking to each other, or maybe they're talking about the same thing, the same word, climate change, but they do it in a very disciplinary, one might be a highly scientific kind of language that often a lot of people don't understand, particularly when they start putting all the charts and graphs up, and then you see that glazed look come over people's eyes about, oh, please, not another slide, And I think that's an issue. Economists think about this in a very different way. And so I'm thinking about the work that we have to do, this systemic work, is what are your thoughts about how we get people to start stepping outside their own professional kinds of perspectives or niches or disciplines to start to kind of see what other people can bring to the table for a deeper understanding of this issue. So the floor is open. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, we're a silo busting organization by definition, right?
Right.
As a coalition, and look, I've worked leading and organizing and working with coalitions most of my career. The successful coalitions are one that are built on developing shared respect and trust and understanding. I mean, it's not that it's complicated to do, but it's not that complicated.
And you mentioned this earlier. I mean, several of you have this relationship building is sometimes that's the hard work. You got to take some time to build relationships.
Yeah, because if you don't, it's too easy to tune out the person who doesn't have the same perspective that you do. The point I made about our solidarity platform is that that it simply would not have happened if our partners, and by partners I mean like individual human beings on our board and our steering committee, hadn't developed trust over the course of 8-10 years. Just wouldn't have happened. So to me, that's really that's the foundation of it, and then part of that is certainly from our perspective is knowing you're not going to agree on everything, but being transparent about that and being very clear about a no surprises rule. Like if my organization is going to do something your organization is not going to like, we'll tell you about that before you read about it in the paper.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just keep thinking about the importance of interpersonal relationships in all of this. I mean, even like my being here, I think is just because I know Carrie, from previous coalition work, and it's about kind of surrounding yourself with a team, and not necessarily a team of people who actually work at your organization, but a team of people scattered throughout the area, keeping their phone numbers close, and reaching out to them and communicating with them when people have questions that you can't answer. And part of that involves setting aside your own ego. I would love to just kind of get the answer from this guy I know and then convey it to the person who may have asked me the question. Maybe sometimes that's the easiest way to do it, just so you don't have to ask that person to jump through another hoop. But just kind of like relinquishing that control sometimes, and just making that introduction and letting them take it from there, can kind of like further the bonds that are being built that don't necessarily include you. And I think that's a lot of, like, at least for me, given my personality, it's something that I've had to learn how to do is I'm not going to control all these relationships, and I'm not going to, some of it is out of my hands, and I should just trust that people are going to do what they're going to do, and let that happen. So again, it's just after a while of doing the work, you get to know all of these people, and you can start connecting them to each other, and it becomes it builds on itself, and then one of the strengths of my organization, I think, is that we have a really strong kind of customer service culture. A lot of the people at Cub, myself included, started out kind of helping consumers with their individual issues. And so we have this kind of ingrained knee-jerk, like we have to call a person back, we have to respond, we have to, and I think, again, looking internally at a workplace, fostering kind of this culture of like responsiveness and responsibility to the people that you're trying to serve and trying to help can just help it grow your own importance because you gain a reputation as being someone who calls folks back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's great. And one of the things that popped up on the chat, and I'm going to read it because I think it's really good, because Aaron from Georgia says, the term climate change will shut down a lot of otherwise productive work and conversation. Do you have suggestions for how to discuss solutions without the terms climate change, sustainability, any alternate, terms or different angles, industries, benefits, etc., to focus on instead? I mean, I think it's a good question, because I think in the highly divided political climate that we're in, to be able to really make some of the kinds of changes we want, and several of you have spoken to this, it's going to mean bringing some of those folks that right now are sort of, hands off, stay away, on board, and make those arguments about, hey, we're all in this together, and maybe, think about this a different way. So any thoughts on that? What do you think? Or is that non-negotiable? Should we always talk about climate change and sustainability, or how do you deal with that, with those issues?
Well, at risk of usurping this whole conversation, I mean, again, I work at the Citizens Utility Board, and we approach all these issues through affordability, control over your own energy usage and your own costs, and energy independence. So I spend a lot of time talking to people who do not think climate change is a thing, but I can get them super excited about solar panels, electric cars, energy efficiency, and I can get them signing a petition, maybe not calling their legislator, depending though, sometimes, yes, in favor of energy sustainability legislation in the state of Illinois, based on, we just want them to have some choices so they can take control of their own energy usage and their own costs.
Good. Those are great examples. Dylan, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in general, look to your local either indigenous communities or cultural communities to talk about and have those conversations about how we describe those things, because I'll tell you, English is a really dull language. I'm sorry if I offend anybody by saying that. It's not very descriptive. It's very, a lot of ambiguity, and it can be very difficult to navigate when we speak only in English. But in our tribal languages, I'll give you an example. Our Ojibwe language is extremely descriptive. It's colorful. It's a great way to convey how we truly feel about something, right? And like in our English language, we might call something a natural resource, right? We call it a resource. We use it for this or that, and it's almost like commodified, right? But in our language, we don't really have a word for that. We would say "wenje bimad diziang," which literally means "from where we get life." And so when you dive deeper into other languages and begin to understand some of those connotations and how something truly means life or death to somebody, and how it truly means to their life, what it truly means to their life way, it's a little bit different of a conversation than, oh, well, climate change is affecting those resources, and it's, we don't need that many. It's a commodity, right? It's spoken about in a different way. So I think that's one of my recommendations, is to kind of reach out, beyond what you're what out of your comfort zone, what you're normally used to talking with, and have these conversations with some of these communities that have been around for a really long time and have a better understanding of the environment and our kind of our ecological communities. So that's one way I would think to better talk about it than just saying climate change.
Yeah.
Additionally, and you talked about silo breaking too, and breaking down those barriers. For us in our community at Bad River, we've been really vigilant, and a lot of communities have been really vigilant in being hospitable and inviting people up for experiences so that they better understand, our way of life. They don't necessarily have to understand it, but they know that it's there and they can respect it a little bit better. And, we take visitors out, out to see our Kakagan Sloughs, which is a Ramsar designated wetland site of importance where our wild rice grows. And from there, seeing that beauty being in those places, you better understand why we're fighting so hard to make sure that water levels aren't going to the extremes, and other impacts aren't affecting that food source for our community members.
Mhm. No, I think that's a great a great insight, and something that people should take advantage of. Jason.
I loved your comments, Dylan, about the inadequacy of the English language. So yeah, language is important. I mean, at the Blue Green Alliance, we spend a lot more time talking about jobs than we do talking about climate.
Mm-hmm.
Because we need to meet our folks where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think we've got a pretty big body of polling and social science research that supports that. And we did polling actually recently in Midwestern states, and in the middle of this moment that we're all in, right? And it became very clear to us that, particularly as we look ahead to next year, and the ability to potentially move pretty ambitious legislation, it's going to be more resonant, it's going to be more effective if we frame it and talk about it in the context of economic recovery and economic revitalization than if we were to talk about it as addressing climate change. The reality is that in economic revitalization, economic stimulus legislation, we can get a lot of what we need to get done on climate, but we don't have to lead with that in terms of how we talk about it. And that is of non-trivial importance. Yeah.
I think those are all good points, and it leads me to think about this. Because one of the themes that is clear from what all of you are saying is that, that first principle, we have to meet people where they're at. And then once you understand that, you realize that we're not all in the same place in this society. Some of us are experiencing this in very, very different ways. Some of us are better insulated to feel against the effects of climate change than others. Some people are a lot more vulnerable. Some people have a lot more experiential, a tactile knowledge of what climate change means. And so that kind of leads me to throw this out, and I think I'd like to get your take on this. Because of this, how much time do you think do you spend any time on just the flat out people who don't believe in climate change? And maybe there's a significant a number of people in our society now that are very skeptical about science itself and the authority of science. Do you think it's useful to spend any time, I mean, visiting with those people? I brought this up in a meeting 2 years ago at a meeting convened at the University Center for Atmospheric Research. And I had people basically, overwhelmingly say, don't waste your time. You're wasting your time. We need to work with, those people who are leaning towards us, or who at least we can talk to. And at the time I thought, well, okay, but I'm not so sure with this growing kind of skepticism or this attitude towards science that seems to be quite popular now, about being skeptical about it and not believing it. I wonder if that's something we can afford to just sidestep. So your thoughts? I mean, I'm talking about the real people who tell you, hey, I don't believe that science. I don't believe it's real, blah, blah, blah. Do you spend any time with those folks?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think so. I know I could probably go back and forth, catch me on a bad day where I'm crabby, and I'll be like, no, don't waste your time, right? But to be real, I think, on the people that don't believe in climate change to an extent, I try to be as compassionate about everything that I do in life. It's something that my grandmother and my great grandmother, our family, have raised us to do, like I'm sure many of you as well. And we're always taught we don't understand people's trauma and we don't understand their story, right?
Mhm.
There's something along those lines, that something along the line of somebody's story that inhibits them from, understanding something or diving deep into, understanding something in a substantial way. And that's not for us to necessarily judge or know much about. But I think that in general, it can be useful to understand and even collect data on where some of this comes from, right? Better understand their reasons for rejecting science, better understand, their reasons for not accepting, or what their acceptable modes of information are, right? They don't believe that a published paper by a PhD student will suffice to sway their mind. What are mediums of communication that they do find acceptable, right? And I think that's how we somehow move forward in that realm. That's just the thought.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Sarah, Jason, any thoughts about that? How much time do you spend?
Well, I mean, look, I think we have to. Certainly as a coalition we do, because
Mhm.
a number of our union members are probably fit that category.
Mhm.
Not because they're bad people,
No,
because
no.
for a lot of reasons it can be symptomatic of deep economic fear. It can be
Mhm.
symptomatic of the fact that a lot of them live within these very intentionally created media ecosystems that we have Fox News and Sinclair Broadcasting and others to thank for. But we got to do it. And I'm just looking at the chat. I mean, just to clarify what I said earlier, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't be talking about climate. I'm just saying we have to be sensitive about who we're talking to and where we start, right? But I know, I mean, I will just say, to be transparent, that this is a pretty intense conversation within my own organization, because we are recognizing that we actually are going to have to do a lot more education about climate and the kind of clean economy we're trying to build with rank and file union members, like the steel workers, right, who work in steel plants and oil refineries.
Yeah.
And those are going to be hard conversations, but we have to have them.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, I don't think I've ever met anybody in the field who's just been like, I don't believe in science, but I mean, I know for sure that there are lots of people who kind of pick and choose based on my conversations with them, like what to believe and what not. And we run into this a lot as a watchdog organization. Since I started at Cub, there's this tension between kind of healthy skepticism and unhealthy skepticism. And a lot of the people who support an organization like mine have quite a bit of skepticism when it comes to kind of the powers that be, which is something I applaud and salute based on my own beliefs. But then it kind of, crosses a line, and then it's like, whoa there. And so again, kind of back to kind of starting where people are at. And this comes up a lot, in Illinois. Grid modernization has happened. So most of the residences in Illinois have smart meters. And of course, there's been a lot of scare stuff out there about smart meters because they use, they use radio frequency to communicate. And people get freaked out about that. And, and again, it's kind of like, I appreciate your skepticism. I do. I mean, skepticism is healthy in a lot of cases. But sometimes it's kind of how to gently convey that in this instance, you don't need to be quite so skeptical. And then especially like I've worked at Cub since 2000, and I've watched a big change in the energy utilities and how they interact with their customer base. Not for the better, to be honest, not because the energy utilities love their customers and they sit around thinking of ways to help their customers use less of the commodity that they sell, but as a result of progression of laws that passed in the state of Illinois that require the utilities to offer their customers opportunities to save energy and save money. So then I'm in this tricky situation where I'm telling people, actually, ComEd is doing a good thing here and you should sign up for it. And they're like, well, no, ComEd would never do that. And so then it's about education. Like, well, ComEd on its own probably would never do that, but we actually got this law passed back in 2011 that is requiring them to do it. And we fought really hard to force them to do this. And so again, it's kind of easier if your organization and the people representing your organization have the capacity to sit down, meaning the time basically, to sit down and kind of explain to folks and connect those dots as to like why this is this way. And sometimes you're just never going to convince somebody, right? I mean, sometimes someone will come up to me at an event and just, you can tell that they're not in that place. And maybe like Dylan said, maybe I'm just a little grumpy that day. And I'm just like, I do not have the energy to deal with you. But for the most part, I mean, we're in this business because we have empathy and we want to make positive change. And we do, at the end of the day, believe in people, despite everything that happens. So we want to put that effort in to try to make that connection and try to communicate positively.
You know, this really reminds me of a discussion I had with a colleague at Kansas University who was working on a large statewide grant on looking at climate change impacts, and his part of the research was to deal with ag, and so we're talking about primarily wheat farmers, in Western Kansas. And these are people who are quite often listening to the Sinclair media group or Fox News. And sometimes, in the cabs of their tractors or combines, they can actually, have those programs on. And his first year did not go very well because no one wanted to talk to him about climate change. But he figured out that if I will quit kind of coming in, hey, I want to talk to you about climate change. And year two, when he started approaching these farmers and saying, gee, the weather's really been doing some crazy things, hasn't it? And how have things, these weather events we've been having, extreme weather events, has it always been like this? And people loved to talk about the weather and how that has changed. Well, that's climate change. But what he also found out too, and what all of you have said has kind of made me think about this, how important it is when we want to build those bridges to utilize the most underutilized communication tool that we have, and that's being a good listener. And I think, it seems to me what a lot of you are saying is if we'll just listen to people, what they know, what they experience, it's not that hard to talk, to make that kind of connection to climate change in a way that it's going to mean something to them. And I think that's really something we all need to be sensitive to. No one likes know-it-alls. I mean, particularly I think in indigenous communities. I mean, in my community, I might have an elder who might say something that, I say, oh, gee, why are you talking that way? I'm never going to say, hey, Auntie, you got to change your language. You're being colonized and you better decolonize. I'm not going to tell my auntie that. I know what she means and I'm going to listen and, we can have a discussion. But I think too often, there are some people who get so enthusiastic about this. You come in, both guns blazing and, hey, we're here to tell you about climate change and how we're going to solve it. And they never take the time to really listen, build that relationship, know who they're talking to. And I think what all of you said made me think about really that's something that we need to really make sure we're training this next generation to be good listeners, to really pay attention to what people can tell them. Everyone knows something valuable, everyone on this planet, because they have experiences you don't have. You're not them. And it seems to me that's something that we could really work on. And I think, Dylan, that you've kind of applied that in your work, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And something that I was thinking about as you were talking about decolonizing and just the notion of trying to be compassionate is understanding everybody has a different history. For instance, this is something that goes through my head. Maybe it goes through other people's heads too. But where I come from, I'm extremely biased, and when I come from a group of people that have survived hundreds of years of cultural genocide and assimilatory practices from the federal government. Many of our tribal communities are extremely resilient and highly adaptable. We're still here. We've survived all of that, right? Tribal communities have overcome removal, boarding schools, federal state policies that sought to eradicate our communities, right? But we're still here, and we've adapted, and we've been able to survive and thrive. And so when somebody in present day won't even talk about adapting and switching to a renewable energy, or refuses to discuss policies that make small lifestyle changes, right? It's interesting to me, right? Because you see that those parallels and those really vast differences in history and where we come from, right? And so I have to remind myself of that bias that I have, and then kind of redirect my energy to better understand where somebody else is coming from.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that topic? I know you guys have all practiced that. I know we're getting, let's see where we're at. We've got some getting close here to, wrapping this up. Got about 12 minutes left, I think. So I'm going to read a couple of things that have come off the chat box, because there's been some really good comments here. So this is from someone's mentioning Travoy.com, a group of people in Kansas City I know, but mention them and some of the good work they're doing. And Adam here, let's see if I can get that all the way screen down. This is interesting. He says, you know, the value of reaching out to people through doing work and hobbies and recreation, even sports together, because the body is a part of cognition. Well said. Even embodied in social cognition, which team sports is dependent upon. So there are opportunities to reach people through group work where there is a group goal. So that's sort of this idea of maybe tapping into areas that ordinarily people might not think about, but where there could really be some opportunities. I'm thinking now about discussions that are going on in Kansas City about expanding soccer fields and those kinds of things. Soccer's getting to be kind of in vogue in the Midwest and gaining popularity. So that becomes an issue that's affected by climate, affected by weather. Any thoughts on how maybe you tie into people who are hobbyists, recreationists that we haven't talked about yet? They're kind of allies, maybe in unusual places.
I have to confess, I kind of live in a bubble. So it's hard for me to kind of speak to that because I do have hobbies and I'm active, but it's a lot of preaching to the choir going on when I'm engaged in those. The stuff that comes more immediately to mind is, you know, when engaging with family and people who may not agree with you politically or about science, etc. Or other people's families. I have a close friend. I hang out with his family quite a bit, and yeah, figuring out how to argue or not with these folks. But yeah, it's hard for me to speak to that just because I live on the north side of Chicago and I have a skewed view of the world as a result, especially now since I'm not out in the field all over Illinois engaging with people through my work.
So Jason, your thoughts.
I mean, I do want to give a shout out to one of our environmental partners, the National Wildlife Federation, right, which I think does a really great job of engaging, as they call it, the hook and bullet crowd, right? Hunters, fisher people, right, who come at this work and this set of issues from a different place, but who deeply value wilderness and ecosystems and keeping them whole. They are tremendously effective advocates in that regard. I do want to go back to the conversation we were having about engaging people. I mean, let's just say it, right? We are living in a moment where one of our two major political parties has become, you know, an authoritarian personality cult. And I say that as someone who's worked with Republicans for over 20 years. And where climate denial and hostility to clean energy, renewables in particular, has become a part of political identity, right? And that's really hard to break through. So that, you know, there are going to be moments when we're just going to have to flat out beat those folks in the realm of ideas and in legislatures, because there's not, unfortunately, I say this as someone who greatly values the ethic of compromise as being inherent in a democratic political system. But as I look ahead to a next Congress where you know, we might have the ability to have Democrats control both the Senate and the House, we shouldn't waste a whole lot of time trying to win people over because we need to move fast and we need to recognize what we're up against.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really a good point. And it seems like one of the tensions we're facing, one of the unique aspects of this particular moment in time in the relative different places we are in the world today. And I don't mean that just, in a metaphoric sense, I mean literally in a physical sense. It seems to me that one of one of the challenges is how we figure out we're going to negotiate um, building relationships, strengthening relationships. That takes time. We know that. And yet we know the clock is ticking. There's a lot of things that we really need to move on quickly. And if we don't, we're going to pay a very dear cost, a very high price for that. And I don't think there is a silver bullet, but what you all have been talking about kind of makes me think that one of the things that we can do is just remember that if we engage folks, find out where they are, listen to their stories first of all, and you begin to see that there might be opportunities to develop an awareness of the kinds of crisis that we're facing with climate. With something that they're interested in. So I was just thinking, I was just on another one of these meetings, these Zoom conferences, I guess 10 days ago, a week ago, and I was on it with a duck hunter from Minnesota. And he commented about the fact he had just been out in his boat and how he decided to spend the night in his boat, and he complained about being eaten up by mosquitoes. And he said, I've never happened that. It's never been this late in the season. And I've been out on, my duck boat, and mosquitoes were a problem, but they are now. I thought about this last year at the time of my son's birthday, October 26th, sitting out on the patio, and I killed a mosquito. I swatted a mosquito. Now I'm right on the south shore of the banks of the Kansas River, 20 miles west of Kansas City. You're not supposed to have mosquitoes up here in the last week of October. Things are changing. So just all kinds of opportunities to get people to think, I think, more deeply about this if we can find something that's a part of their experience. Yeah.
I'll also just say too, in addition to that, oftentimes, and this is just my opinion, that oftentimes that, the old systems and the individuals that promote these old systems that ignore climate change science and promote fossil fuel, and they lack progressive forethought, right? It's easy to continue on in the ways that we've been doing things and continue on with the status quo. But it takes, true visionary people, to be progressive and to think of new alternative ways that are healthier and better for us, better for the environment. So I think about that, and I encourage people that when you're casting your vote, right, when you're enacting your ability to vote, you think about that. You want individuals serving you that are going to be smart, progressive, and forward thinking, or you want individuals that are just going to kind of keep things the way it's easy to keep things the way that it's been going. That's my opinion. And what always perplexes me, and you understand this too, Dan, is that a lot of our tribal communities have this seventh generational principle
Right.
that's integrated into everything that we do. Right? We're constantly thinking, not as much thinking about our now, the right now, but constantly thinking and perpetuating that thinking of our 7 generations to come in the future. And
Right.
if it perplexes us as tribal communities that not everybody thinks that way, right? That we're trying to make this place a better place for our great grandchildren off into the future. And some people are simply just trying to live, day to day and not have to think about the future and not have to think about what's left behind for them. And so, it's a very, very big difference, in ideological thinking and perspectives and how we care for this place.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Dylan. I see the clock is ticking down. We've got a few minutes left here. I just want to thank everyone for their participation. And there was a comment that was made, and I don't know that we've got time to dig into it, but I want to honor it because I think we're all feeling this. One crisis to handle, is tough. But when we look around the world, we're living in a time where we're laying crisis on top of crisis. Jason and Sarah spoke so directly about the economic crises that we're in. I mean, we are in a fundamental economic crisis that's sort of unparalleled since the Great Depression. Lay on top of that the COVID pandemic. Okay, we've got that. Lay on top of that, then people who practice subsistence kinds of economic life ways, what they're experiencing. They are experiencing a food crisis right now. And so we've got a crisis in our education, a crisis in the economy, a political crisis, a climate crisis. And someone mentioned, we've only got so much bandwidth. And right now, I think one of the challenges we have is people are so stressed out about so much that sometimes climate change, they're just in room. They're in room in the bandwidth to take that in. And I just think our awareness of that and being sensitive to that can help us be better communicators and workers in the interest of, letting our mother, this earth, help us save ourselves. But we got to pay attention, and that's a challenge. And I don't know, how are we doing on the clock? I think we're kind of winding down here.
I think we're just out of time there. If you have any last thoughts, then I'll thank everybody.
Yeah, any panelists, the last pearl of wisdom, something you want to share quickly?
Looks like we're in good shape. Thank you again to everybody who joined us today. We had over 100 people at different points, so it's been a great turnout. Dr. Wildcat, really appreciate you hosting this panel. Sarah Moskowitz, thank you. Jason Walsh, thank you. And Dylan Jennings, thank you. This has been a great conversation. I've certainly learned a lot, so very happy to be a part of this.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.